There is no human intimacy which can compare for closeness with that which results when two men divest themselves of their divisive beliefs and convictions, and make their contact solely on the basis of their common human needs and weaknesses. Concerning the fearsome theologian, or, to give him his actual name, Pan Wiadomski, the following facts developed. With all his haughty and chivalresque bearing, with all his Roman warlike character, he was nothing more than a weak and sickly child of our day. Born into a not particularly well-to-do family, his father was a poor provincial doctor. He had in his childhood shown an extraordinary gift for classical languages. For reasons I never learned, he broke off his academic studies in the middle, became an independent student, and began to travel. When his reputation was ruined by the repeated forgeries in ancient documents, he took to teaching, his pupils usually being students of the classics, the children of wealthy parents. His independence and pride stood in his way, and he never did well at his profession. On more than one occasion, invited to a country estate during the summer in order to prepare a student for the fall term, he was sent away before ending his contract as a result of his arrogant behavior. Nor was this all. There were adventures with the parents of the students. There was a good deal of litigation in the courts, and the consequence was that people began to avoid him. Now he was living from the sale of the remaining fragments of the huge library which he had accumulated, and of the dubious original documents which he had brought back from his travels. Still, this did not cover even his modest needs. He helped himself out by living in a state of semi-starvation. The apartment he occupied had been his since before the war. The tenant protection laws prevented the landlord from throwing him out, though he had not paid rent for years. There he was, occupying an apartment owned by a Jew who did not dare to do anything against him. Now and again he delivered a lecture arranged for him by old acquaintances of his, mostly gymnasium teachers. At rare intervals he was lucky enough to get one of his notes on some classical subject. He still flooded the editorial offices with them, printed and paid for. The wife of the janitor, an old woman, cleaned his rooms for him twice weekly, not for the occasional pitiful pay he could offer, so much as for charity's sake. Such meals as he took, he cooked for himself on a Primus stove which stood in the kitchen. This room, like all the others, was chock-a-block with packages of books, newspapers, and documents. Everything seemed to point to the probability of a first-class fire, but if anyone had dared to point this out to him, he would have had his head snapped off for his pains. He was a lonely man, and, with all his bitterness, so I convinced myself later, not a bad man. Certainly he hated the common people, the plebs, and he never failed to buttress his contempt for them with relevant quotations from the thinkers of old in the original languages. But it could not be said that he displayed any particular sympathy for the rich. In fact, if anything, he had an even greater hatred for the opulent and mighty of the earth. Against them he quoted the words of the New Testament, in the original Greek, "It is the rich who oppress ye, who bring ye before the courts." His keenest contempt was reserved for modern times and for modern life, and no level of the population, no system of society was to his liking. Contemporary life refusing to offer him a place within, he felt himself to be an outsider. He had, if one may so put it, taken refuge from our age, and fled to the age to which he belonged, to the men he knew best, to the circumstances and incidents with which he was intimately acquainted, and which interested him most. With regard to the history of the Roman age, he had a wide knowledge, which must have been derived from sources known to him alone. To classic episodes, the records of which are strictly limited to definite sources, he added a wealth of details from his own imagination, but these were so much in keeping both with the incidents and the characters to which they related, that they seemed, like his doubtful documents, to be partly authentic. He imparted to his stories a verisimilitude which destroyed the interval of 2,000 years, and brought them so close to our own time that he might very well have been a participant or spectator. Thus, for instance, he would weave something queer into his recitals of events concerning Germanicus and us, the Secunda Italica. "What do you mean by us?" I asked in astonishment. "Oh, I am speaking of the 2nd Legion, which consisted entirely of Romans," he would answer, and a faint tide of color would creep up his withered cheeks. After a time, we dropped this subject. Just as every anti-Semite has his Jew, of whom he is prepared to make an exception, so I became Pan Wiadomski's personal Jew. He found a new name for me, Josephus. This was, in fact, a title of distinction, for Pan Wiadomski thought the world of Josephus. He could hardly have lived without me. If I missed one evening's visit, I was sure to receive a letter from him the next day, and I must confess that I, too, became greatly attached to him. In the first place, I loved to listen to his stories. His reading was immense, and I learned a great deal from him. Even the remainder of his library constituted a huge collection of classical literature, both in the original and in translations, and he was glad to give me access to it and even to find for me the passages which I needed. In spite of the polar difference in our outlook on the events of that period, our common interest in the time of the Second Temple held us close together. Over and above all this, his character, bitter, sharp, and obstinate, I might say his quixotic refusal to compromise, which had brought him so many enemies and isolated him from his contemporaries, aroused in me, in spite of frequent hurt and irritation, a definite respect. I became convinced that his sensational discoveries, which had done him so much harm, were not the result of deliberate fraud and dishonesty, what, after all, had they brought him, but sprang from a naive and fanatical enthusiasm for the subject in which he was interested. Like quite a number of anti-Semites, he had a special relish for Jewish delicacies. They were probably spiced for him by the feeling of forbidden fruit. I used to bring him, from the Jewish quarter in which I lived, little presents: Jewish white bread, Jewish black bread, a piece of herring, a pickled cucumber, or even a slice or two of Jewish sausage, and we used to eat these dainties together over the tea which we drank during the long evenings. He never failed to express his thanks, not in so many words. A kindly word could not get past his lips. It was as though a psychological filter prevented its passage, but by his looks or by a smile, and that, too, was seen seldom enough on his face. On one occasion he fell sick. He caught a cold and ran a temperature. I took care of him for several days, and brought a doctor who prescribed for him. I sat up with him a couple of nights. He was so touched that he actually said something pleasant. He confessed that he had never suspected that a Jew could be capable of playing the Good Samaritan. And thus, without our willing it, or did we, on the contrary, actually will it, there developed between us an increasingly friendly relationship. There was something curious about it. We were like two fellow countrymen who, in their old hometown, had always lived on the worst of terms, and who now found themselves thrown together on a wild and savage island at the other end of the world. Just as every lonely man fastens on the first person who shows a sign of friendliness, just as every sick man catches at the hand held out to him and tries to enslave the entire body of his rescuer, so Pan Wiadomski clung to me with convulsive fingers and would not let go. I really do not know what happened to me. The moment I heard that he was sick and could not leave his bed, I became uneasy and felt I had to hasten to his side. And then, before I knew it, I found myself with a broken old man on my hands, and I was the one mainstay, such as it was, that he had in life. I felt that I was bound to the man and could not liberate myself. The worst moments occurred in the late evening, when the time came for me to leave him and return home. It transpired that he was afraid to remain alone through the long, sleepless nights, and he used to hold on to me until the small hours. He was proud. It was hard for him to betray the fact that he was dependent on someone else, and yet he did it. When I began to intimate that I had to leave him, something childlike came over him, and he almost begged me to stay on. He began, during that period, to take a closer interest in me, in my personal life and my studies. He even expressed the wish to re-educate me. The first thing for me to do, he intimated, was to subject myself to the Roman discipline, and in this connection he naturally did not fail to remind me that if the Roman character had vanished from the world, it was the fault of us, the Jews, who had introduced into the ancient empire the disintegrating principle of a Judaizing Christianity. He desired to recreate in me, the unfortunate individual, the greatness that had been Rome. I listened with a show of sympathy, for I could not help feeling the warm rays of friendliness and even of love, to whatever extent this concept could be applied to him, which were breaking for the first time through the cold iron walls in which his soul was encased. But I still did not get a glimpse of the famous manuscript which had been the subject of our first conversations. It had simply dropped out of the picture. I was determined not to be the first to refer to it again. It would seem that his interest had shifted. He questioned me a great deal concerning the life of the Jews in the period of the Second Temple, and I was astounded by the range of his own knowledge in that field. His information was, to be sure, such as is to be found in our Jewish sources, but he added to the various incidents on which we touched a color peculiarly his own, and a wealth of unfamiliar details. He was acquainted with the ceremony of bringing the first fruits to the temple, likewise with the rituals of the Day of Atonement and of the Day of Water Pouring. I asked myself more than once where he could have obtained this knowledge, whence came those details which were unknown to us. On one occasion he even inquired of me concerning the relation of the Jews to the high priests, and he spoke of the old high priest Hanan, who had had 5 sons and a son-in-law, all of them high priests. It was in the time of the incumbency of Joseph Caiaphas, the son-in-law, that Yeshua of Nazareth had been condemned, and the old man was not without guilt in the business, this last being added with a smile.